If the human being is unhappy and unsatisfied, then he or she has learnt that which was hammered into him or her by Billy, Edward Albert Meyer.
If the human being was unhappy and unsatisfied from his or her childhood and still is today, then the reason for this is that already very early, as well as in the course of his or her youth and his or her maturity, he or she has learnt to pay careful attention to what the ones bringing him or her up, and also fellow human beings hammered into him or her in regard to right and wrong. They could do this, and perhaps can still do this today if he or she is still under their influence, because he or she was or still is dependent upon them. However, that already in his or her childhood, youth, and also in maturity, he or she has consciously or unconsciously always behaved defensively in some way, and probably still does this, has allowed him or her to survive in consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche-based form. Hence the fact is that over all the years of his or her life up to now, he or she has learnt to distance himself or herself somewhat from the inappropriate criticism and rejections on the part of the ones bringing him or her up early on, as well as the ones otherwise instructing and advising him or her. An action on his or her part which caused, and perhaps also today still causes those who have brought him or her up, instructed and advised him or her, or still do this today, to be satisfied with him or her, and at least not rake on him or her with nasty words, and not rudely criticize him or her. However, if now it is assumed that the whole thing belongs to the past, then henceforth it is only the past that shall be talked about. Hence, observed and considered from this perspective, everything is a long time ago and in a time set back, just that he or she had to follow the accommodating, the thinking, and the wishes of others and dance according to their tune. Thereby, at the very least unconsciously, he or she has not forgotten the negative past, which was brought upon him or her and hammered into him or her. Thus still today it burdens him or her and makes him or her unhappy and unsatisfied, without him or her probably being conscious of the origin of it. However, the fact is that he or she could not assess the modes of behavior which were hammered into him or her and negative responses of others in his or her childhood, youth, and, under certain circumstances, also in his or her maturity. Thus he or she was also not in a position to avoid their criticism and violations. The whole thing has so very deeply imprinted itself on his or her memory, and today extensively determines his or her unhappy and unsatisfied life, namely in regard to himself or herself, as well as the existence and his or her fellow human beings. Already in his or her childhood and youth, whether he or she is still in denial about it or not, he or she has of course rebelled time and again against recommendations, norms, rules, prohibitions and regulations, etc., of his or her parents or other ones bringing him or her up and his or her pedagogues, which probably has come about in such a way also in his or her maturity in relation to superiors, etc. In any case, however, it happened like that in his or her childhood with the so-called defiance phase, as well as in the time of puberty. And if he or she can and wants to recall it, then he or she must acknowledge that he or she has often already gone into a defensive position before anybody demanded or wished for anything from him or her. Indeed, not always, however, at least often he or she has benefited from this, because his or her behavior led to the fact that he or she has gotten more attention than usual. However, the whole thing was also a process in order to find out what he or she actually wanted. However, fundamentally, he or she had no great success with it, and if he or she is unhappy and unsatisfied today, then this says that this is also still the case today, and that in his or her current life, this has also not succeeded for him or her up to this day. Hence, in this respect, he or she cannot strike up a song of victory. Rather, he or she must now first begin to work up the power of action in himself or herself with all his or her energy and power, in order to do something in self-initiative for his or her happiness and his or her satisfaction, as well as for his or her inner freedom and harmony, and for his or her inner peace. This is the way which he or she must go, and this means that, in the consciousness and with his or her thoughts and feelings, he or she must distance himself or herself preventatively from that which the fellow human beings do not want to see in him or her, precisely concerning his or her unhappiness and his or her unsatisfaction, which not only drastically get on the nerves of himself or herself, rather also on those of his or her fellow human beings. However, there are also all wrong modes of behavior which come forth from all the negative things. Thus he or she must recognize these and become conscious of them in order to avoid them and to not attract negative attention. Effectively, he or she has a hold over becoming happy and satisfied and behaving in his or her inner and outer nature in such a way that nobody thinks badly of him or her and also does not notice how he or she is exactly coping morally in one moment or another. Hence he or she must adjust to the true life and place all his or her own valueful impulses, longings, desires, and wishes in regard to an equalized, happy, and satisfied life first. And if he or she does this, then he or she does not have to anxiously take heed of not attracting attention and coming across badly with his or her fellow human beings. Hence he or she does not have to be sad any longer, nor allow his or her grief to reflect on his or her face. Fundamentally, if he or she is unhappy and unsatisfied, he or she must strive in good measure for his or her inner peace, his or her inner freedom and harmony by devoting himself or herself to the change for that, turning to everything valueful which is new and allowing everything negative of the past, which is old, to be past and not worry about it any longer. He or she must do exactly that which he or she wishes for himself or herself in the best, good, and positive sense, and also actually do it for himself or herself. Because this is the salient point, because he or she must not positively want something, rather he or she must do it. High or sheer problem in this regard consists in the fact that he or she still does not know this, and thus also cannot act on it, because only the knowledge about it brings him or her to this action, and this happens only once he or she goes the direct way to his or her own wishes and the realization of them. However, this also means that he or she must act out of his or her own love for himself or herself, because only then does everything feel right in him or her for his or her new, good, and positive behavior. The will of his or her intellect must realize that which is new, better, good, positive, and valueful out of the world of experience, namely free from anxiety and fear, free from repressed thought values and feeling values, and free from grief and anger. And if he or she who long ago has been hurt in his or her inner nature does this, then he or she finds a very good way into the future of his or her life and of existence. Then he or she finds a way out of his or her self-created hell of unhappiness and unsatisfaction, and out of his or her unpeace, the inner unfreedom, disharmony, and all his or her injuries. If he or she wants to go through his or her life uprightly, gladly, freely, happily, and with satisfaction, he or she must decide on his or her uprightness towards himself or herself and his or her honest wishes for the true life. This uprightness, this honesty in regard to himself or herself, he or she must rigorously maintain, so that he or she does not lie to himself or herself even a little, and also not to his or her fellow human beings. He or she must not lie to himself or herself, even not when he or she often sees himself or herself tempted, and he or she thereby deceives himself or herself, if he or she does it regardless. He or she must not do this, however, rather he or she must trust himself or herself, and be honest to himself or herself, because only thereby is it possible for him or her that he or she can go his or her own way. Thereby he or she must be the center of his or her own attention, and, in doing so, not painfully look back over decades in which he or she has suffered and had to care only about others, because they demanded this of him or her, and he or she thereby lost himself or herself. This has never been worthwhile. On the contrary, thereby he or she was only frustrated and became a human being who went forth sadly and neglected to love himself or herself and to walk his or her own new way in life through existence. However, this requires a lot of power of action, because only when he or she musters it up and he or she consciously turns to the new way and also actually treads it, can he or she veer off from and also effectively break out of his or her old and complicated mode of life and mode of behavior. And if he or she really does this, then he or she leaves his or her old unhappy and unsatisfied life conduct, which on the one hand he or she has adapted to his or her old wounds from his or her childhood, youth and his or her early maturity, and on the other hand to the broad mass of his or her fellow human beings, who as a rule also on their part are not the most happy and most satisfied ones, which however they very wisely disguise. And it is really those, as well as those from his or her past who badgered him or her, who envy him or her for his or her learning and better life behavior, and who will not give any compliments to him or her for his new and positive behavior. He or she must realize this, because it makes them afraid if he or she no longer goes forth in unity with them and their own wrong behavior in life, and he or she allows them to play their own perverted and strange game. And if henceforth he or she steers his or her own life onto better tracks, becomes happy and satisfied, and no longer participates in their game which perverts life, then he or she must realize that he or she must search for new friends, namely, this time honest, good, and true friends who do not insult him or her as abnormal and crazy, because from now on he or she lives in happiness and satisfaction. He or she is truly not abnormal and not crazy if he or she develops into that which is better and good, and therewith into a life behavior which is worth living, which makes him or her happy and satisfied. Consequently, he or she must not get involved with the cynicism which is shown to him or her by all those who are poor in intellect and rationality, who do not find their own way to the irreproachable self-love, to the inner peace, to the true happiness, to the soothing harmony, and to the satisfaction. And if these unknowing ones and troublemakers insult him or her as abnormal, naive, crazy, and unworldly, then he or she must calmly allow them to do this and answer them with thanks as though their bullishness was an utter compliment. In fact, they simply know no better, because they themselves are in a bad fairway of life, upon which they allow their ship of life to drift rudderlessly in a bubbling sea of unhappiness and unsatisfaction. They do not comprehend him or her, because they themselves slide along upon the worn-down rails of their unhappiness and their unsatisfaction and observe and consider their life as normal in this regard. They do not have the strength and the power of action to do something themselves for their own well-being and for a better life. Thus they do not make progress as a glowing example and go not the way of joy as well as their own peace, love, and harmony in a true happiness and in satisfaction, and are not able to lead a fulfilled life. Hence he or she shall pay no attention to them if they show him or her malice, because they do this out of unintellect and irrationality, and in addition not against him or her, rather towards themselves. And if he or she behaves rightly towards them, and he or she distances himself or herself from all that which they throw at him or her in insults and accusations, then he or she must always remember that above all, he or she must get free of the clutches of his or her nasty world of thoughts and feelings of the past, and he or she must not burden himself or herself with that any longer, because only thereby can he or she win and become glad, happy, and satisfied. Hence always and first and foremost he or she must think of himself or herself and of his or her well-being in regard to his or her equalizedness and healthy self-love, his or her personal peace, his or her own freedom, harmony, and of his or her happiness and satisfaction. This in no form has anything to do with something bad, rather with a healthy and necessary egoism, which is pre-given quite naturally through the self-preservation drive. The human being must steer his or her life into the right tracks and do only that which is right, because it has neither a sense nor brings benefit to him or her, if he or she simply adjusts to the conditions and to that which he or she just does or does not do. However, if he or she does it regardless, and he or she simply adjusts and unconsciously does only that which he or she is just in the mood for, then he or she does not become a happy and satisfied human being. On the contrary, in this mode he or she becomes all the more unhappy and unsatisfied, because that way he or she unconsciously goes along in all his or her anxiousness, in his or her sadness, and also in his or her vulnerability and anger from his or her complicated childhood, youth, and from his or her painful early maturity, whereby he or she is driven to loveless thoughts, feelings, and actions which harm his or her psyche. He or she is not conscious of his or her inner state in this regard, wherefore he or she does not look after himself or herself and does not positively learn to love himself or herself in life as well as existence. This is the reason for the fact that he or she is ruled by all that which has become imprinted concerning that which is evil, negative, bad, unhappy, and unsatisfied in his or her childhood and youth as well as in his or her early maturity. However effectively this does not have to be, because out of his or her consciousness, he or she can and must learn to live no longer after the old experiences and their lived experiences. Rather, he or she must be concerned about getting enough love out of himself or herself so that he or she does not treat himself or herself badly, and he or she does not disappoint himself or herself. Only thereby can he or she get free of all that which has hurt him or her and violated him or her in his or her thoughts and feelings and has caused wounds deep into the psyche. And he or she must clearly and distinctly be conscious that as long as these wounds are not healed by himself or herself, and therewith by his or her thoughts and feelings, his or her life will not take a better turn towards being happy and towards satisfaction. And also the living together with those human beings who have done terrible things to him or her in his or her childhood, youth, or in early maturity will remain painful for him or her. Hence he or she only has the one and only opportunity of getting free of all that which is old and painfully burdening by turning to that which is new and valuable, learning from it, and thereby dissolving everything from his or her past which torments him or her consciously or unconsciously. However, this means that he or she must become conscious of all the connections and make an effort to lead his or her own life, and no longer only be concerned about simply making everything right for other human beings. Hence he or she must live that which makes him or her joyous and happy and satisfied, because that alone brings the only real fulfillment for him or her. He or she must end the search and the pathological craving, and also the constant attempt for recognition as well as for acknowledgement and love of other human beings, and direct everything solely towards himself or herself, because he or she must give himself or herself recognition, acknowledgement, and love. He or she must reject the criticism of others who want to keep him or her from that, because in relation to himself or herself, he or she on his or her own must know and be honest with what he or she does in his or her everyday life, and in regard to his or her own development concerning his or her world of thoughts, feelings, psyche. Only his or her healthy intellect tells him or her what he or she has to do in order to be happy and satisfied. However, following his or her intellect and having free rein in the right form requires his or her own uprightness and consciousness, as well as his or her power of action and the necessary time which he or she must take in order to examine everything very closely and assess it rightly. He or she must examine how he or she lives, in which area of life he or she is himself or herself, which human beings he or she feels comfortable with, where he or she cannot and must not disguise himself or herself in any form in regard to his or her behavior, and where he or she can and must hold his or her opinion, and how and where he or she can live that which he or she really wants, and what makes him or her loving, peaceable, friendly, free, glad, happy, harmonious, and satisfied. If the human being is unhappy and unsatisfied, then lovingly and with power of action, he or she must follow that which his or her inner voice tells him or her in regard to becoming happy and satisfied. This means that he or she must end his or her behavior in regard to listening solely to what others say, serving them and dancing around them and dropping to his or her knees, bowing and bending before them for a little recognition. He or she must be himself or herself and behave in the right mode, because only in this mode can he or she be a human being who uprightly masters his or her life. Just as it was at any time in the past, the present and the future also are dependent upon having strong human beings with willpower who, full of energy and vigor, know how to master their lives, and as role models are also able to take along the great mass of humanity in the time hurrying forward, by teaching them and giving them power in order to accomplish something valuable themselves. Hence, the human being must also be a human being who shows the way to truthfulness, true love, freedom, peace, and harmony, as well as happiness and satisfaction, which, however, he or she can only do if he or she treads the true way of his or her positive development, and he or she becomes a happy and satisfied role model for his or her fellow human beings. Hence, he or she has to consciously decide whether he or she wants to go the new, better, good and positive way in his or her future, and accept the reward which beckons him or her in the form of all inner values such as equalizedness, true self-love and love for his or her fellow human beings, the fauna, the flora, and the entire world, along with peace, freedom, happiness, and satisfaction. If the human being is unhappy and unsatisfied, then he or she must encourage himself or herself and leave his or her unconscious and loveless way of his or her blindness in relation to life and his or her dormant reality. He or she must end all his or her unright compromises which he or she made with his or her life and existence. Thus he or she must do all that which is of importance and value for him or her and his or her personal well-being. This means that he or she must turn away from always doing only that which others expect of him or her for their own benefit and profit, namely, even when the others, who call themselves relatives and friends, turn away from him or her. Hence, he or she shall not be glum if they turn away from him or her when he or she strives for his or her better, good, positive, and right way of life, and for similar modes of behavior. If they turn their backs on him or her, or even try to pressure him or her so that he or she does not tread his or her own valueful way, and they want to win him or her back so that he or she continues in the same old style, then this shows that they are lacking in their honesty towards him or her, and also in true kinship and friendship. If they are truly his relatives and friends, then they respectfully stand by him or her in his or her efforts and support him or her in every conceivably necessary respect. However, actually he or she will have many painful experiences in this regard and also live through them, because here and there it will be proven that he or she was only loved and liked because he or she has gone along with the rules of others imposed upon him or her. However, now breaks them if he or she reflects on his or her own well-being, and he or she sets off to become a happy and satisfied human being. From here and there, he or she will probably hear verbal attacks, perhaps will be bestowed with exclusion and withdrawal of love, indeed even be exposed to calumnies in one's own family, as well as in the circle of acquaintances and friends. However, if he or she adheres to his or her efforts of his or her change to that which is better, good and positive in regard to his or her entire world of thoughts and feelings and his or her modes of behavior, then he or she will reap great success and transform his or her life into one which is characterized by good, right, and true self-love, by inner peace, by joy, freedom, harmony, as well as by being happy and satisfaction. If he or she courageously and powerfully goes the right and true way of his or her life, then he or she must recognize that he or she is often treated with intolerance to a high degree by many, which, however, only happens to be the case because the fellow human beings concerned are afraid of his or her power of action for the right and valueful life conduct, and are not able to put themselves on an equal footing with him or her. Therefore, they segregate him or her and calumniate and condemn him or her, because they are not able to match him or her, because they are failures at life. However, otherwise, he or she attracts human beings who uprightly and loyally stand by his or her side, namely because they want to tread the same way as he or she wants to tread, or have already found the right way and are treading it. These human beings are the ones who understand him or her and who provide assistance in every necessary situation, because they have learnt to understand that the culmination point of the true happiness in life, the happiness and the satisfaction as well as the inner freedom and harmony and of the true inner peace, is to be reached solely by consciously treading the necessary way and by working on gaining these values. And he or she can do this only by bringing to bear his or her uprightness and his or her truthfulness and love for himself or herself, and deciding against that with which those human beings want to burden him or her in demands, recommendations, and prohibitions, which are only for their own dishonest use. However, as a result, they prove nothing other than that they are deficient in every respect in relation to life and are misled by a delusion of their irrational rationality and their intellect. On the contrary, in addition, he or she is and must be a human being who is his or her own ruler and master and a pioneer of his or her own development to the righteousness and correct life conduct, as well as his or her own happiness and satisfaction.
Simyase Silver Star Center. The 1st of January 2015, 2357 HRS Billy.